Okay, adding somebody else here. All right, so now let's go ahead and get started. Whether this is the first time you're joining us or you're a returning champion, I'd like to welcome you to this Arlington Heights Memorial Library program, Best Practices in Preparing Targeted Grant Proposals. My name is Diane Malik. I'm the Business Services Advisor here at the library, and I'm joined by my colleague Jamie, who will be with us as well today. I am pleased to be able to introduce you to our presenter, Ellen Stone. Ellen has served in organizations working with individuals with disabilities for over 15 years, progressing from direct care positions to an executive director level position. She has a comprehensive background in engaging and advocating for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the delivery of services across the nonprofit sector. Working within the disability sector provided her with the opportunity to work with nonprofit, public service, and government organizations in the fields of health, education, employment, public policy, housing, recreation, and community services. She understands the challenges of working in a small nonprofit organization, never enough time, and every staff member wears many hats. Currently, she enjoys putting her knowledge to work supporting nonprofits, consulting in fundraising, grant writing, capacity building, and working with nonprofit staff to ensure long-term sustainability of their organization. So Ellen, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who work at a nonprofit, as Diane said, I recognize that staff time is limited and there's never enough of it. And also funds are limited. So grant writing is generally part of the joys of working at a nonprofit. If you're a board member or a volunteer, sometimes you end up writing a grant and maybe you've never done it before, or a staff member said, hey, this opportunity is here. Can you write this grant for me? And so then you're just thrown in and you're not quite sure what you're doing or what the process is or how you go about it. So this training is targeted at providing basic background in how grant writing works, what the basic types of grants are, what the best practices are. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can see the presentation. All right, is that there for everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, so all right. And go over here. So today we're going to go through several different things. We're going to talk about the most common types of funders. There are different kinds of grants that you can submit for. So we'll go through the list of different kinds of grants and what that means for the actual proposal or application that you would be submitting, and what makes those grants similar and what makes them different. And also what type of grant applications there are, the differences between letters of inquiry, proposals, and applications. They're terms that get thrown around loosely, and some people recognize the differences between them, and some people think that they're all the same. So we'll go over that. And then there are general components that are similar in most grant applications, proposals, and letters of inquiry. And so we'll just go through each segment, talk about what content you want to include in those segments, and things that sometimes people throw into those segments that don't really belong there. So try to give you advice on the best practices. And then how you can tailor each grant to the specific funders, because funders get generally anywhere from 5 to 10 grants grant applications for every grant that they're actually able to issue. So you want to give your application the best possible chances for success. We will have opportunities for questions twice throughout the presentation, once about at the midpoint and once at the end. So as Diane said, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box so that you don't forget them. And we'll go through those as those slides come up. So the three primary kinds of funders are governments, foundations, and corporations. Government grants exist at the local, state, and national level. Local grants are the easiest government grants to apply for. Those would be things like community development grants or I just lost the word. If, for example, in the various COVID funding, CARES Act, there has been a lot of funding that has gone to local governments. And some of that gets redistributed out to nonprofits. If your local government is distributing the funding, the applications are usually less complicated because it's presumed that your local government knows and understands the organizations working in their community and the needs of that community more clearly than the state or national government. The higher you go in the government, the more complicated the application becomes. So I'm working on a government grant right now that is 20 pages of narrative and probably 20 to 30 pages of attachments. That's a federal government grant. It will take me probably close to 50 hours of writing, and that's me as the grant writer. That's not any of the time that the organization is putting into the grant. And that's a grant for $750,000 that'll be distributed over 3 years. So their odds of getting that grant, who knows? There will be a lot of applications, and the government is distributing 17 grants this cycle. So that's a federal government grant. Their budget for that grant is currently 7 pages long because there are budgets for payroll, there's a budget for equipment, there's a budget for office supplies, there's a budget for pretty much everything, and every budget is separate. Like there's not a single budget for the program. So the higher you go in government, the more complicated it gets. With government grants, they can go to just about anybody. They can go to for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, government entities, tribal entities, schools. They're much less specific. Foundations, which could be local family foundations, community foundations, or large national foundations like W.K. Kellogg or Annie E. Casey. Those almost always are issued to nonprofit organizations. They very rarely issue grants to governments or to for-profit companies. Sometimes they'll issue grants to schools, but that's less common. So those applications have to match the guidelines of the funder. Some funders will accept applications from any nonprofit. Some say they only accept applications or proposals by invitation. That really varies by funder. When you are doing your funder research, if you use the Foundation Center, it will tell you in their little research profile which ones only accept applications by invitation and which ones don't. Some funders will state it explicitly on their website, or if you pull up a funder's 990, there's a checkbox on the 990 that says only accepts applications by invitation. Right below that checkbox, if it's not checked, it'll give application instructions on the 990. Currently, as we've moved forward, I mean, I've been submitting grants for 20 years now. Most foundations now have websites that give you the details of their mission, their application guidelines, their frequently asked questions about what they want to fund and why, and their funding history, and whether or not they actually want to talk to potential grantees before they'll issue a grant, and that varies by foundation. So I strongly encourage you to do your research and check into those things, because the more you find out about a foundation before you take the time to write a grant, the better. Corporations have grants. Some of them do it through a foundation. Sometimes they'll funnel their money to a charitable foundation, like corporate giving programs. Sometimes they do it less formally and they just do sponsorships, or they'll call them grants, but it's not actually done through a foundation. It's just a charitable giving program. So if you look at a corporate website and you look for their corporate social responsibility programs, you can find out information on how a corporation gives back to their community. Whether they call it grants or sponsorships or both, you can just find that information. McDonald's, Starbucks, banks give back to the community. A lot of times they have requirements. Banks often have requirements, especially if they have gone through mergers with other banks. They have to give a certain amount of money back to their community, either through low interest loans or just through donations. That money usually has to go to individuals who are struggling with low income or in poverty, or they might designate some of it for people who are homeless or trying to gain financial skills or gain employment, or businesses that are trying to establish themselves. That's usually where banks give their money. But if you look at the corporations, they will have very specific guidelines for how they are going to invest their money. And again, sometimes that's going to be a sponsorship program. Sometimes they're going to call it grants, but it's not through a foundation, so you can't really do research on what they've done in the past. And sometimes they'll actually have set up a foundation, and so then you can conduct full research and find a 990 and find a grant making history. It just depends on the corporation. As I mentioned earlier, there are three primary types of grant applications, or three primary ways of applying for grants. The typical easiest application method is called a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent, depending on the funder. If it is written out longhand, it's typically 2 to 3 pages. It's your introduction to a funder, or if you've worked with a funder in the past, it is your way of introducing the funder to a new opportunity at your organization for them to invest. It's a brief overview. It's not every detail about the organization or every detail about the program. It's an introduction. So it's sort of like speed dating for grant writing, I suppose. So when you are submitting a letter of inquiry, you really want to send in the highlights. So this is what we are doing. This is why it is unique. This is why it is new. This is why it is important to our community. but you don't get into the nitty gritty of this is our budget, this is our timeline, this is our plan for sustainability. None of that goes into a letter of inquiry. You do want to talk about why you think the organization or the program aligns with the foundation, because this is your opportunity to hook their interest. And if you don't hook their interest, then they're not going to ask for a full proposal. Some foundations will actually fund grants off of a letter of inquiry. And again, you only have 2 to 3 pages to convince them. So you have to show thorough alignment with their funding priorities and their mission. But you only have 2 to 3 pages to do it. And most letters of inquiry do not allow for substantial attachments. So you're not sending in budget documents, you're not sending in a ton of marketing materials. When I work with clients to write a letter of inquiry, I tell them that they can't send more, if they're sending it in as a physical document, they can't send more than 2 attachments with it. And that's if a funder allows just general submissions. So they might send like a 1-pager about the program and a general brochure about the organization or their most recent annual report, but that's it. That's all you get to send them. A proposal, on the other hand, is a full description of the organization or the program with a detailed request for funding. Some funders begin the application process with a proposal. Others only request a proposal after they've accepted your letter of inquiry. So check before you begin the application process and make sure that you have the time to commit, because some funders use the letter of inquiry and proposal as a weeding process. I have gone through, I did one with a bank actually in Washington for one client that we did, their members had to nominate nonprofits for a grant, and my client was nominated. Then we had to submit a letter of inquiry, online application, and we were approved. And then we had to submit a full proposal, and we were approved. And then their membership voted on which nonprofit to move forward. And then we had to submit a video, and then their board voted on which nonprofit to fund. And at that last step after the video, we didn't get funding. So we had spent a boatload of time by the time we had done all of those application steps in order not to get funded at the very end of that cycle. So pay attention to how many steps they have in their cycle and make sure you have the time available. That organization that I was working with in Washington is a relatively large nonprofit, and they have the time available for that process. But if you're a small nonprofit with limited staff, that might have been very taxing in order to come away with nothing. But for others, it's a simple proposal, or it's a letter of inquiry followed by a proposal, and that's the end of the process. A proposal, if it's written out longhand, is typically 5 to 8 pages. It will typically come with attachments. There might be 1 or 2 attachments. There might be 8 or 10 attachments. It really depends on the foundation. An application is, in current grant writing, submitting either the letter of inquiry or the proposal through an online grant portal. So the content that you're submitting through the grant portal is either what they would be requesting through a letter of inquiry or what they would be requesting through a proposal. And you can usually gauge which version by reading their grant guidelines. So if they say that they're going to request just your IRS determination letter as an attachment, or just your organization budget as an attachment, their application is probably going to be a letter of inquiry version. If they say that they're going to request your audit and your
Financials.
letters of support and lots of other information, then they're going to be asking for a proposal. It just varies. So getting into the actual content of what would go in, I'm going to go through the content of what goes into a proposal. If you're submitting a letter of inquiry, all of this gets scaled back and you would just limit the amount of content in each of these sections. So a cover letter. All grant writing is telling your organization's story. And you want to tell a compelling story because you're trying to convince the funder that your nonprofit is worth their investment. And the cover letter is your introduction. So the first way to start out is not to be generic. You want to address the cover letter to a specific person, not to an organization. And you find that out by looking at their website or looking at their most recent 990. Generally, you want to address the cover letter to the board chairperson or the CEO. Ideally, I would address it to the board president or chairperson because that is who is leading the committee making decision makers. The CEO is leading the staff, but the board of trustees is making decisions about grants. In the very first paragraph, you want to tell the purpose of the letter. Who are you serving? What program are you requesting funding to support? You know, why are you reaching out to this funder? And you want to end that paragraph with a very specific and clear ask. So an example would be a $15,000 program support grant from the specific foundation will allow us to bring after-school robotics and drone programs to 2 middle schools in low-income communities for the 2019-2020 school year. So you've got the grant amount, the program, the type of, so this is the type of support, the name of the funder, and what you're going to use the money for. This doesn't necessarily have to be the last sentence in the first paragraph, but this sentence or something similar needs to be in your first paragraph. Also, either in the first or the second paragraph, you need to explain your connection to the foundation's mission and vision. Why did you pick this foundation to submit an application to? There, you know, is it that you have a history with them? Have you submitted grants to the foundation in the past? Do you have connections there? Does your board chairperson know their board chairperson? Or do you have clients who have received support from their foundation in the past? Or do they have a mission related to the environment and you're running a camp that's providing environmental education? Draw a very clear line between what they are doing and what they care about and what you are doing and what you are caring about. Make it explicit. If you have made contact with the organization or with the foundation, talk about it. A lot of foundations provide trainings or community events. If you've attended them, tell them that, because their staff might know that, but the board of trustees doesn't know that. If you have set up meetings with their staff to discuss your grant proposal and get their input on your proposal, discuss that in your cover letter. You know, Carol was very, you know, our discussion with Carol or with your program director was very helpful in guiding this proposal. Let them know that you sought their input. Also, make sure that you are submitting the cover letter on letterhead that has contact information. I have seen letterhead from nonprofits that doesn't tell how to get in touch with them. If your letterhead only has your logo on it and it doesn't have your address, your organization's address, phone number, and a general info at, contact at, whatever email address, add it. People need to be able to get in touch with your nonprofit organization, and putting all of that information directly below the signature takes up a lot of space, and you don't always have that space in the letter. So put it in the header, put it in the footer. It belongs in your letterhead. It doesn't belong in the letter content. Finally, make sure that the signature is from your organization leadership. Foundations expect your grant letters to be signed by whoever leads your organization, whether that is your CEO, your executive director, your board chair. I have had foundations who require both signatures on grants. So read the directions, and if both signatures are required, make sure you have them. And that does go into reading the directions several days before a grant is due, so that if you need your board chair to come in and sign a letter, you have time to get them into the office. Common mistakes that I have seen in grant cover letters. One is being redundant. The cover letter is not the place to put all of the same content that you're going to put in your proposal. Funders have a lot of reading to do when they are reviewing grant applications. They don't want to read the same thing twice. So your cover letter is the introduction. Your proposal is the actual description of your organization and what you're going to do. Don't repeat yourself. Mistake number 2 applies throughout your grant. And this is true of your cover letter. This is true of a full proposal. This is true of online applications or letters of inquiry. Do not use big words that people would have to look up in the dictionary. Do not use jargon that is specific to your field. Funders are not experts in your field typically. Whether your field is disability services or housing or arts or the environment. So stay away from acronyms unless you define them within the grant content. Even then, I still recommend staying away from them. Stay away from any word that I generally recommend about a 9th to 10th grade reading level. If you were talking to a 9th to 10th grader and they wouldn't know what the word is, don't put it in your grant application. You don't know who's going to be reading it. You don't know what their linguistic level is, and you just don't want to make it hard for them. Also, most of these people are going to be reading grant applications in the evening on their, like at the end of a workday. They're going to be tired. Don't make them even more tired by making them tax their vocabulary. So just use simple language, use simple sentence structures. Don't make reading your grants hard. Also, check for grammar and punctuation errors. All of us have received emails from people who don't check for spelling, grammar, and punctuation errors, and we think, this doesn't look very professional. The same is true when you are sending in grants. If it doesn't look like people have taken the time and effort to proofread, then that looks like your organization is not professional. And there's an example here on this slide. I misspelled ask. Ask others to edit. Just check things, be thorough. Use grammar check in the applications or use an application like Grammarly. Don't submit work that is not thoroughly reviewed because it makes your nonprofit look like you are not running a professional organization. So when you get into the actual proposal document, the first segment is traditionally the organization history and background. This might be called organization history. It might be called organization background. It might be called description if you're doing an online application. It doesn't really matter what the name is. The content is going to be roughly the same. What they're asking is who you are, who you serve, why what you do is important. It's the beginning of your story in the actual proposal content. So where you start your story is the beginning. When was the nonprofit founded and by whom? So, we've been serving people with disabilities since 1973. If you have a specific founder, you can name them, or we were founded by parents who were frustrated by not being able to find the supports and services they needed in their community. Or if you are a shelter for unhomed animals or a no-kill shelter, we were founded by community members who wanted to stop, provide a shelter that did not euthanize. Whatever the founder's reason for establishing a new nonprofit was, and also provide the year. You want the mission to be in the organization history and background, but you don't need to explicitly state it if you stated your mission in your cover letter, or if there was a mission box somewhere else in the application. So if there's anywhere where you said our mission is XYZ, then you don't repeat that, but you do rephrase it just to drive home the point. So you can expand on it. You can state your vision instead of your mission. If you have a mission and a vision statement, you just want to make sure that in your organization history and background, you are clearly indicating your purpose. And then you want to tell what you do. So it's the population you serve, how many lives you impact each year, whether that is animals or people, or the number of acres that you clean up in the environment, or the number of trees that you plant, or whatever service you are providing. You're impacting lives is the goal. So indicate that in a clear, quantifiable way. Indicate the programs and services that you provide, whether that's camps or youth programs or childcare or community cleanup or whatever it is, list them out. And your geographic footprint. Are you working in a specific community? Are you working in a specific town? Are you working in the entire Chicago metropolitan area? Are you working in the entire state of Illinois? Let them know what your geographic range is, because some funders are specific. They may only fund a limited space, or they may be looking to fund a broader range. And what makes you unique? There are so many nonprofits, and a lot of them are working in the same field. So, how many nonprofits are there in your community that are serving the homeless? What makes your organization different from the other 5 organizations that are also serving the homeless? Uh, Tell them what makes you special. Show that you're stable. This goes down to your board's commitment, their governing capacity, and diversity of funding streams. So if you rely entirely on grants, that's not going to be a good thing. But if you have a combination of grants and donors and maybe fee-for-service revenue, or an endowment, or just a broad base of support, then that shows that you will continue operating as a nonprofit long after this grant finishes its funding cycle. And that makes you a good investment. Clearly connect to the foundation. So as you're discussing your organization's history and your story and your background, tie it to the foundation's mission, vision, and guidelines. And the way that you do that is by using their language. So, if they care about the environment, then talk about the specific features of the environment that they care about. Maybe they care about the watershed in your area. So talk about the watershed in your area. If they care about the river in your area, talk about the river in your area and what you're doing to maintain it or clean it up or restore habitat. But look at the words that are on their website or on their social media and incorporate that language into your document. Follow the directions. Sometimes they will ask for specific content in your organization history and background. I have seen funders request things that don't make sense in this content area. It doesn't matter if it makes sense. If they tell you to put it in there, put it in there. If they ask for specific things, use their verbiage when you're putting it in there so that they know that you have included it. You just have to make sure that you're hitting all the marks when funders provide very precise directions. So, and sorry, show your organization is stable is not the right heading there, but the heading there is make sure that you are, sorry, I lost track of my train of thought. Sort of summarizing the organization history and background is, if you're doing an online application, there might be a character limit to this section. Usually it's going to be 500 words or 2,000 characters. So if that's the case, your priorities are the content the funder has provided or the order listed above. So the most important things are your beginning, your mission, your vision, your values, your programs and services, then the stability of organizations. But you want to go through things sort of in the order that I've listed when you have a character limit. Things that you want to leave out. Too many details. Like I said, you're only going to have 500 words or 2,000 characters if you're doing an online application. This is a good guideline if you're writing this in free form. You don't want your organization history and background to be a full page. That's not a brief summary. So you don't want to write every single thing that you can think about why you created this organization or everything that you've done in the last 60 or 70 years if you're an organization that's been around that long. It's a summary. Information that's covered in other sections. So this isn't the place to put all of the data that you're going to put in the statement of need. This isn't the place to put how you measure outcomes. This isn't the place to talk about your budget. This is just a summary of where you come from as a nonprofit. Testimonials, this isn't where you talk about what your clients think of your organization. Generally, you only insert testimonials in a grant if they are specifically requested. Sometimes putting in a quote is a good thing in a grant. When I do that, I put it in as a visual break. So there's an example here where there's a picture and a quote from a client. I would put that in as an aside somewhere in a grant where I think I needed space because it's just solid text all the way through the grant. But that doesn't actually go in the content of any section because I don't have a testimonials or a letters of support section in most grants unless it is specifically requested from the funder. Questions? Have there been any questions so far?
There hasn't been anything in the chat, Ellen, other than asking if the slides will be shared afterwards, because a few people have said that the charts are great and will be really helpful later. So I let them know, yes, we'll share those after, but that was it for now.
That will be it. Just real quick, while we're on this page, does anybody have any questions? If you want to send them in or if you want to unmute and ask them, I'll give a minute. And it's also been 45 minutes and we've got 45 minutes left. So if anybody needs to stand up and move around, I know 90 minutes straight through can be a lot. So if anybody has anything.
Yeah, please feel free to unmute and ask a question.
I have a question. It's Michael Klee. You mentioned that for the like the initial inquiry or the proposal that you can add a couple of attachments, particularly for the inquiry letter. Is it okay to just put a link in the letter, or is it actually best to just attach the attachments?
That depends on how you're submitting it. If you're printing something out and sending it in, then a link doesn't work because nobody can click on it.
But it would still have the website. I guess the question is it
Right,
better to just attach documents?
If somebody has to type in the link, that's annoying.
I see your point.
So if it's something that is brief and easy, then that might be fine. But if it is complicated, it's not really very convenient. So like having your website in your organization's letterhead is not substantially annoying because it shows them how to access your website and find out more about your organization and your programs. But if it's a link to your annual report on your website, so then they have to type in your website and go down 2 menus because your annual report is in your latest news section, and then it's the annual report link. So it's your website / latest news / annual report. That's a lot to type. So that's an annoying link to have to type in all the content. It's easier if you just print the annual report for them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
I have a question about uses of funds. If the primary purpose of seeking the grant is to cover legal expenses because of litigation on an issue, is that treated differently than maybe operating funds for an organization?
I would say probably. that's something that I think very few funders would. That's something that I would specifically discuss with the funder and make sure that they were willing to support. Because a lot of funders actually would exclude that if you look at their funding guidelines. I've actually seen that excluded in a lot of funding guidelines. So that is something that I would highlight to the funder as the intention of the funding. General operating support is things like payroll or paying for your website that you run all the time, or paying for your rent. So I would definitely say paying for litigation would be different than general operating support.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. So the next segment in a proposal is the statement of need. And this is the continuation of your story. And this is true whether you're talking about a general operating grant for your organization or a specific program grant. You want to clearly define what problem you're trying to solve and substantiate the presence of that problem with data. And the data that you're providing is not the need for your program, as in people are coming to us and requesting services. It is community need, as in this is the level of poverty in our community, or this is the environmental spill that occurred in our community, something that is documented in sources outside of your organization. So you begin your statement of need with 2 to 3 sentences describing the problem. And this is the most storytelling aspect of the statement of need. You want the reader to visualize the challenge, and you want to grab their attention, because the rest of the statement of need section is data heavy, and it's generally going to be harder to read because you're just talking about numbers, or I mean, even if you're talking about people, it's numbers. So if you look at the infographic that's on the right, in Central Florida, 1 in 6 families are food insecure. 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry every night, and 42% of Floridians are 1 paycheck away from a crisis. If I had put all of that into a paragraph, that's hard to read. So, but that's the content that belongs in a statement of need. And that's the way that it's going to read as you put the statement together. So think about that kind of data. That's why you need the first 2 to 3 sentences to be a gripping visualization of need. The data that you're providing in your statement of need, like I said, needs to come from primary sources. Government, so the census, the Bureau of Labor of Statistics, either nationally or at the state level, colleges and universities, preferably within your region. Although if you're working in a specialty area like disability, it might be from a college or university that's far away that does a lot of research in your field, because they'll study disability in every state across the country. Peer-reviewed journals, especially if you're looking at something in the medical field, excuse me, or recognized quality sources, things like Pew studies or major foundations. W.K. Kellogg, Annie Casey, MacArthur put out a lot of research in the nonprofit field. United Way puts out a lot of information. National media sources, NPR, PBS, even the primary networks like NBC, CBS, ABC during the year will put out information if you're looking for information on crime or politics or education. Sometimes you can find that from media sources, although I would recommend the other options on this list before I would recommend the media, just because they're not, the media is considered the most biased option on this list of options, if that makes sense. You want your data to be less than 5 years old. When people send me grants to review and all of their data sources are 10 to 15 years old, I tell them to rewrite their statements of need, because nothing that is 10 to 15 years old tells you about the current needs of your community, especially if that, because those research studies take time to print, especially if they were published research by a college or university or a peer-reviewed journal. The research was probably conducted a year or two before it went to print. So it might have been published in 2000, but the research was conducted from 2016 to 2018. If we talk about something that's 10 years old, so it was published in 2010, that means the research was done from 2005 to 2008. That doesn't tell me anything about what's happening in Chicago metro area right now, because this is a completely different community on most levels than it was 10 to 12 years ago or 15 years ago. So that's why you want data that is less than 5 years old, if that makes sense. I also strongly recommend using data from 2 different sources. So if you use government data and university data, or government data from the state level and the federal level, or university data and a foundation's data or United Way's data. If you can get data from 2 items on this list, that's great. But that substantiates the need and substantiates that you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. That multiple players believe this is a need in your community. So when I was writing a Victims of Crime Act grant, I pulled data from actual crime reports at the state level, and I also pulled data from the local community's assessment of homelessness in women and why those women said that they were homeless, and domestic violence was one of the reasons. And that's what I put in when I was submitting a request for Victims of Crime Act funding for a women's shelter. So that's 2 different sources that are very different reasons for looking at the data that substantiate that there was a domestic violence problem in that county, and Victims of Crime Act funding should go to a domestic violence shelter. You want to provide specific demographics for the target population to be served. This isn't necessarily the demographics of your organization. This is the demographics within your community. So what are the available people who could be served by your organization? If you serve victims of domestic violence, how many victims of domestic violence do they estimate there are in your target region? If you're able to serve 100 of those people a year, that leaves potentially 700 people unserved. I don't know. I'm throwing things out there. but you've got to list how many potential people there are, in addition to saying how many potential people you can serve. That's what the demographics are. The demographics would also say what your communities, so if you have it, what the income range of that potential population might be, or what the ethnic range of your community most likely is. It really depends on the grant and what demographics you're going to need. You need to connect the statement of need back to your mission and vision. So how does this problem connect back to what you do as a nonprofit? Why is this what you're trying to address? If you're a disability services organization, why are you addressing domestic violence? Maybe it's because people with disabilities are the most commonly abused population. They have the highest abuse rate of any population on which data is collected. So maybe that makes sense, but maybe domestic violence isn't the right word there. If I were actually submitting that grant, maybe it would be an abuse prevention program or a abuse victim support group, not domestic, or maybe domestic. I don't know. I haven't written that grant. But if I were writing it for a disability organization, it probably wouldn't be domestic violence. It would be violence or abuse victims grant, because domestic violence doesn't necessarily make sense for that specific population, because I've got to tie it back to the organization's mission and vision. So then we've got to go through and check for content required by the funder, just like with the organization history and background section. Sometimes they will require you to talk about organization capacity and qualifications, or similar organizations working in this field and duplications of services. One suggestion, if they talk about organizations, other organizations and duplications of services, and there are other organizations who work in this field, remind them of what makes you unique and what makes your program unique. And so even though it seems like there's a duplication, this is why you're there. Or you talk about unmet needs. So with the example I gave of domestic violence, if there are estimated 700 victims of domestic violence in your community, but currently only 250 of them are being served, then there is an unmet need, even though there are currently domestic violence shelters available. So yes, you're an additional nonprofit serving the same population, but that population's needs are not met with the available services in your community. That is how you address a duplication of services question if there is actually duplication in your community. You've got to figure out how to get around their question if that situation exists. They may ask about specific demographics. Go through the questions that they're asking and make sure you come up with every single one of them. So it might be income, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, county or region, sometimes zip code. One of the grants I'm working on right now, it's census tract. You never know what it's going to be, but go through their list and make sure you catch every single one of the qualifications they ask you to contain in that statement of need. And then you've got to make sure that you're maintaining your story. Remember, I said grant writing is about telling a story. You're telling the story of your organization, of your program, of the population you're serving, and why it is important. Yes, the statement of needs section is a data-heavy, math-filled section of content. It's not very fun to read, but it's still part of your story. So make sure that it falls in line. However you can do that. If you're not a good storyteller, talk to somebody else in your organization who is a good storyteller and figure out how to tie it in, how to tie it back to people or animals or the environment, and make even a bunch of numbers pull at heartstrings. So here are some examples for you. I gave the example of reading the infographic on the left in a paragraph would be difficult. Reading any set of data in a paragraph is difficult. So you still have to put the data in paragraph form because that's what the statement of need requires. But then you can put it in an offset that makes it easier to track and line up all the numbers that follow in a bunch of sentences. So maybe it's an infographic, maybe it's a chart, maybe it's a table. You know, like look at the data, see what makes the most sense, and present it in that way. There are a lot of online tools. You don't have to pay you don't have to pay money to come up with good presentation options anymore. So the table right here is just simply created in Microsoft Word. These two right here were both created in Canva, which there's a free usage license. So you don't have to pay for the advanced Adobe suite that is super expensive. I made both of those in Canva for free. So you just import the words and you import for this one, I imported the picture, I set a screen over the top, and then I added words. That's all that one was. These ones, I imported a bunch of graphs, I set the sizes on them, and then I put some words at the top. And both of those were free. But this looks a lot easier to read than any of that data presented in sentence format. For all three of these grants, that data was also presented in sentence format in the grant verbiage. But you can also see that all of this data, with the exception of this one, follows what I said about data sources. Census.gov. This is the West Virginia Labor Information and the West Virginia Department of Corrections. This information came from Operation Family Caregiver, which is Rosalind Carter's institute for military caregivers, and this was submitted by a nonprofit in Washington state. So a national foundation providing data for a local foundation. This grant, they used data from national assessments. So kindergarten readiness, they used the ages and stages assessment. So not quite the way that I would recommend. Another grant writer actually wrote this grant and I created the graphic for her. So that's not the way that I recommend it, but it was a good graphic. So I threw it in here. When you are creating graphics or as you are writing up your grants, be sure that you are citing your sources. All three of these cite the source of the information on the infographics or tables or charts. Also, when I am doing the grant narrative, it would be cited either in the verbiage. So the United Way Alice report 2017 states would be the way to do it in the narrative, or you put it in a footnote or These ones are obviously in captions. You want to tell the funder where you're getting your information. That way they know, A, that you're not making it up, but also if they want to seek additional information, they can find it. They can verify what you're telling them. The measurements and outcomes section. Sorry, just taking a drink. This is one of the sections that I find a lot of nonprofits struggle with. And the reason that they struggle with it is that they don't collect data throughout the year. So if you aren't collecting data, I encourage you to start, even if you're not ready to start submitting grants yet. In this section, I will refer to a couple of different things. I will refer to outputs, outcomes, and impacts. These are 3 different ways of measuring what you're doing as a as a nonprofit. So outputs is just measuring quantities of activities. So the number of people that you're serving, the number of animals rehomed, the number of meals you're providing, or dental appointments, whatever you're doing, maybe the number of kids who attend a camp, it's a quantity. And it's not bad to list quantities. I indicated that you should be listing quantities in your organization and history and background. How many people or lives or whatever your service area is, are you impacting every year? You want to measure quantities because it's one measurement of your organization's success and impact on your community. But quantity doesn't tell you how you are making a change in the lives of the people you're serving or the community that you're serving. So if you are an environmental organization, if you are working in a watershed that's over a certain number of acres, you might be planting a certain number of trees each year, but how does that impact the watershed or the forest area? Like how does planting 100 or 1,000 trees a year impact the environment? What are you actually restoring it? Are you making a difference in river quality? Are you like, what is the actual impact? Impact is how you're making a difference in lives, in the community. What are you changing? What is the positive long-term effect? Outcomes is sort of the quantifiable, measurable difference. So you might, like, that might be measured as learning. So if you do a pre and post test, the student increased knowledge. That's an outcome. But the impact of increased knowledge is that they are more likely to get into college. So if that makes sense as a difference between the 3 words. I just wanted to clarify that before I go through this section. So I already went over measuring outputs, which is relatively simple and something that is perfectly viable to put in as one of your goals or measurements in a measurement and outcome section. Sometimes you will track organization progress as your measurement and outcome section. Somebody mentioned general operations grants. On a general operations grants, you might be purchasing items or hiring staff or writing policy and procedures manuals. Those don't necessarily change the impact of your organizations. They don't have direct impacts on the lives of the people that you're serving or on your community. So they're hard to write measuring impact kinds of outcomes for. So then you just say, you know, by the end of the grant, we will have purchased a cargo van and developed policies and procedures for use and trained our staff and put the cargo van into circulation. That might be how you measure goals for that grant if it's a capital grant. And that's perfectly viable because it's a capital grant. Or the capital grant, if it's a building grant, maybe you're building a new dining hall and that will increase by the time you build the dining hall. A year or two later, you will increase services, but that's not going to be measurable by the end of the grant cycle. So within the actual grant, you're only measuring building. So sometimes you're measuring progress for participants using standardized or published tools. For particularly within the education sector, this is easier for funders because then they can verify your capacity as an organization. They can verify the quality of what you're doing. So if you're working with high school students providing tutoring, the goal might be to improve SATs or PSAT scores. And the long-term impact is that that increases the likelihood of getting into college. If you are working with preschool students, you might be looking at, doing the ages and stages questionnaire with the kids and making sure that they are staying on track with their developmental milestones, or if developmental issues are identified, making sure that the students receive access to the supports and services that they need, whether that's special education services or occupational therapy or whatever it is, so that they can catch up or so that they don't lose ground. So those metrics from an educational perspective are things that are standardized across others who are working in the similar field. And if funders are specifically interested in funding education, then those are metrics that they are familiar with, and it's comforting to them to see metrics that they are familiar with. If you are using those metrics, you want to connect them back to impact in your narrative. So if you're using the ages and stages questionnaire in your child development program, the goal is kindergarten readiness. If you're tracking developmental milestones throughout the child development program over multiple years, your children are more likely to be ready for kindergarten when they finish your child development program at 5 or 4+ or 6 or whenever they exit kindergarten, if all of that makes sense. So the next step is tracking participant or program progress or impact with formal internal tools. So these are things that your organization develops, not things developed and standardized by outside organizations. It might be a survey, it might be an evaluation, it might be a pre and post test series, but you're gathering data and you're gathering it consistently across all participants in a program. You might be using it to measure impact, the long-term life change. You might be using it to measure outputs, and any combination thereof. You might be using it to measure outcomes, participant satisfaction, knowledge retention, environmental impact, environmental change, or just the the outputs in terms of planting or recycling. It could be any number of things that you're actually measuring. Change in opinions, change in thought processes. That's also something that you could be measuring. It depends on what your goals are, but all of that can be tracked with internal data collection tools. So the sort of the gold standard, if you are trying to measure impact, is outcomes that are verifiable by observation. So these are two goals that I pulled from previous grants. One is 25 families will obtain and retain housing that meets their full cost of living and accessibility needs. So for that one, you're looking for housing that's within their budget and that, if they have a disability, also meets their needs, either currently or anticipated. So that's a complicated thing, but it's something that can be independently verified both by a case manager and by the family and by an outside observer. So you can look at the unique number of families that were housed, you can look at their income levels, you can look at the cost of that housing, and you can look at the accessibility of that housing because it's actually listed in the rental agreement. Or if you're doing an employment program, 80% of employment services clients will obtain a position that is sufficient to meet their basic household needs. 75% of employment services clients who obtain a position will remain employed after 1 year. So that one depends on the grant being a 2-year data tracking grant. Most of them are only 1 year, but it, gives that option. And I just realized we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go a little bit fast. So for grants, we've got two different things. You've got your revenue sources and your expenses. And I'm going to skip this slide and just go to the next one that shows the example. So under revenue sources, we've got the revenue from this grant listed here. We've got the revenue sources from other grants that are listed here. And then we've got our total revenue listed here. If we go under expenses, the expenses are grouped under subcategories. So this one was a capital investment grant. We've got the kitchen upgrades and the dining hall upgrades. There's the item description, and then there's a 1-sentence explanation of what each item actually means, because a 1 or 2 word description doesn't actually tell you what the item is. Over here, we've got the total investment. So what is the total amount from the donation, grant, whatever the revenue source is, and then what is the total cost of the item here? If you've got subcategories, you want to total them. I recommend having a line and then doing that in italics so that it's clear when you've got a total line. And then you've got totals at the bottom. I do that in bold. And then you've got your total investments column. That's your total project budget. To make it clear, this foundation line, that's the money that's coming in from this grant. So you go through and allocate it. So some of the money is going to various sub items. Obviously, it's not covering the full cost of some of these items, and that's fine. That's actually what funders want to see, that they are not being asked to cover the total cost of a project. So we've got the other funders here. It was only $7,600. And then that funding is also allocated. On this one, because it was a capital project, we listed the amount to be raised at the bottom. That's how this budget was submitted. You'll notice at the top it says insert logo here. I always put logos for each nonprofit on every document that I submit. It's at the top of every page of a proposal. It's at the top of every budget. It's everywhere on a grant so that they don't forget who each page belongs to, because sometimes things get separated. So this is a program budget. It's slightly different. This one was fully funded, and I was only asking for one grant. So the name of the foundation was here. Actually, we did have $12,000 in additional funding that hadn't been secured when this grant was submitted, but most of the money was coming in through fee-for-service revenue, and that's listed out up here. Well, not most of the money, but a fair amount of money was coming in for fee-for-service. And we actually did get an additional grant for that remaining 12,000. But then if we come down here, I listed out where we would be spending each specific amount of money from that foundation. And then the remainders were left. So we were asking them for 20,000. The total budget was 44,152. And the reason I didn't detail out the other funder is because so much of the money was fee for service. And I didn't know with the additional funding coming from that $12,000, whether that grant money, which items were going to be paid for with grant money and which items were going to be paid for with fee for service. So I only allocated the grant that I was requesting, and I didn't allocate the rest of the remaining budget. You'll notice on here that I did the math. So anything that had multiple items, the math is done in the description. The total item is just a single figure, because you don't have like a cost, quantity, total on these budgets. It's just a simple display. I said that there's a lot of attachments that funders could request. This is just a list of some of the more common ones. Board list with affiliations. When they request that, a lot of times what clients send to me is a list of board bios. They don't want the board bios. They want to know who the board members are, when they join the board and or their board term. Check the fine print to find out what they're asking for. Board officer positions, so who's your board chair, your secretary, your treasurer, etc. Where they work, so do they work for major corporations in your community? Do they own their own business? What is their title at that organization? Are they the owner, the CFO, a attorney, blah, blah, blah. Oops. And any additional affiliations. Are they serving on a nonprofit board, on another nonprofit's board? Are they members of professional organizations like a doctor's association or a realtor's association? Are they members of service organizations like Rotary or Kiwanis? Are they serving on government boards or committees, whether that's city council or the workforce development board or the mental health board? All of those count as affiliations, and they want you to list those for your board members. Commonly required attachments also include staff bios, resumes, or job descriptions. While they might list it simply as a bio or a resume, read the description of what they're actually asking for, because the words don't necessarily line up with the description. Your verification of 501c3 status, and that might be both at the federal and or the state level. Your operating budget, which is different than your program budget or your grant budget. When you're sending in your operating budget, you don't have to send them every line item. If you've got a very detailed organization operating budget, you can collapse those sub-levels. So going back over to this, if this were my operating budget, I could collapse everything under organic budget, organic garden here, beds, plants, other, compost, and just do organic garden total. The same for organic farm. I would just do the total line. You don't have to do all those sub lines when taxes and fringe benefits, you can just do your payroll total. And they may ask you for your funders, either your donors, previous grants, or anticipated funding for this current project. To tailor the grant to this funder, I'm out of time. So are there any questions really quick? You guys can read through this later.
Okay.
Sorry, I just want to be respectful. I said I would have questions at the end, and we've only got about 3 minutes left.
Anybody would like to unmute and ask a question? Okay. If not, that's fine. I'm going to just say a couple things, and if you still wanted to jump in, you could. First, I just want to thank Ellen for that presentation that was full of so much good information. Also, I want to mention that our library is a Foundation Information Network partner. And so you can access Foundation Directory online at the library, which can be helpful because it's a great research tool when you're trying to identify funding and grant makers and things like that. And if you have questions about that, you need an introduction to it, that kind of thing, I'm going to put my email right now in the chat. I would encourage you to contact me, and I would be happy to set up a time to go over that with you. We also have some upcoming programs that might be of interest to you, and you'll find them in our program calendar, and we'll also try to include them in a survey email that you'll get after this. Grow with Google, use YouTube to grow your business is going to be on Thursday, April 29th, which of course, a lot of these programs will say business in the name, but nonprofits as well. That's at 7 p.m. on April 29th. We've got Grow Your Small Business with a Strategic Marketing Plan. That's on May 11th at 2 o'clock. And if you want to know more about how to use online library resources for business, I'm going to be going over that on Monday, May 17th at 6:30. So just kind of to put those in your head, there might be something that you're interested in there. If you want to go ahead, oh, I'm sorry about my dogs. If you want to go ahead and stop sharing, Ellen.
Sure.
Sorry about my dogs. And are there any questions for Ellen then? While I was saying all that, maybe somebody thought of something they wanted to ask?
I see one from about 10:45 on here about where you research funders. There are several funder research options online. The Foundation Center is one of them. And they are currently offering a free login option if you reach out to them due to COVID. So normally you would have to pay for that, but right now you can get in for free. Grant Advisor has reviews of foundations, things like how long it takes to submit applications, sort of feedback from other nonprofits who have submitted grants, more so than actual information about grants. One thing that it's not necessarily ideal for grant research if you haven't if you don't know who you're looking for. But if you know the name of a foundation and you just want to find out a little bit about them, you can always look them up on GuideStar. And if you pull up a foundation's name on GuideStar, you can look at their 990s for the last several years, and that will give you, at the very end of the 990, a list of the grants that they have issued. So that will tell you what organizations they funded and usually the funding amounts. Sometimes, especially the larger foundations, won't provide a full list on that. Their accountants get around it somehow, but the vast majority of foundations will list their grants on their 990s. But if you don't know the foundations, GuideStar is not the most effective research tool.
Yeah.
Normally, when you're not in the middle of a pandemic, it does cost money for most of the research tools, including the Foundation Center.
Any other questions?
The other question that I see on here is related to seeking funding for an individual, and I would rather reply to that directly. So Diane, if you can maybe connect me to that person.
They'll have to reach out to you. Do you want to put your email in the chat?
I might, sure.
Okay.
I didn't go to that last slide. My email, actually, when you send out the presentation, my email's on the last slide.
Okay, yeah, we're going to be sending that to everybody. And I also want to mention that because we have Foundation Center online and we're a partner, also through the library, you can access their database. It's called Grants for Individuals or something like that. So that's something else as well. If you have questions with regard to the library and that, my email's in the chat. And Ellen's we're going to be emailing that to all of you as well. So you'll have whoever you need to reach out to. Please do that. Feel free to contact us. So I want to thank Ellen again and thank everybody. And with that, I think we'll sign.
I hope it was helpful. Sorry, I sort of rushed at the end. I wasn't
a lot of good information.
The clock very well.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.
Have a good rest of your day.